Ame and Enryosashi are not absolutes. They don't happen in the same way every time, but they're behaviors that depend on an evaluation of context and situation. So um, Japanese students will evaluate any context along two continuum. The first one is the dichotomy of uchi and soto. This is the idea of whether someone belongs to the inside of your social group, or they're insiders, whether they belong to the outside of your group, whether they're kind of strangers to your social circle. And the dichotomy of omote and ura, and this refers to the idea of whether a conversation is taking place in public, are other people watching your conversation, or whether this is a private conversation just between you and the person you're talking to with no other witnesses. Now in 1976, Lebra proposed this schema that you see in front of you that shows that there are four kind of different possibilities here. The paradoxical possibility of a public inside communication. Well, it doesn't really happen because it's a paradox, so it's not really worthy of consideration in the study of willingness to communicate. But in an inside private evaluation, we see that intimate and relaxed behaviors are acceptable, and for a Japanese student this may mean that their filters are down, they can talk freely, they don't have to worry about what they're saying to other people, and so their willingness to communicate may seem to be very, very high. In an outside public evaluation, then things have to be a bit more formal, a bit more ritualistic to adhere to normal sort of social behavior. Students have to be careful what they say, they have to filter things carefully, and they have to use polite language. This will hinder willingness to communicate and what students are allowed to say in this context. And finally, the idea of an outside and private communication situation. Now this leads to an anomic situation where normed behaviors are not available. So students don't really know how to communicate at this stage. They don't know how to behave. And this can lead to things like panic and silence. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. An absolute silence. Or it can lead to things like very strange, impolite behaviors taking place. Now, the evaluation of situation is not just subject to these two dichotomies. In addition, we need to think about hierarchy and, for example, with students, their educational background. So for Japanese students, when they evaluate a situation, they also have to take into account hierarchy. And Confucianism is important here. We know from Confucianism that age is important and that men tend to take precedence over women in traditional Confucian backgrounds. So this hierarchy will have, I guess you can call it a power influence on communication, in that people who are higher up in the hierarchy have the freedom to initiate conversations and say what they want to say and interrupt and so on. And for somebody lower down in the hierarchy, when they're taking part, they're probably more likely to agree or stay silent, and they're not able to initiate turns in conversations, and this has a strong impact on willingness to communicate. Also here we need to think about students. In classrooms in Japan, students have a very Confucian background to their education. Now this means things such as books are important, teachers teach down to students and they give them information from books. And so students are expected to show deference to their teachers, students are expected to memorize what are in books, and they're expected to read a lot. They're not expected to talk a lot, they're not expected to ask questions, they're not really expected to challenge ideas. And also from this we can then expect that students might suppress willingness to communicate, they might suppress their oral communication to show respect to the teacher, they might be silent to show that they're thinking carefully or that they're listening carefully to the teacher. And then if they're expected to get the answer right, then they're going to be very slowly, carefully constructing sentences in correct grammar to give the correct, as it were, answer. And again, these things all impact strongly on willingness to communicate and reduce free active communication. So what I'd like to do to conclude is to quickly just talk about two different focus of interpersonal behaviors. In the Japanese context, we see Maynard's quote, "The self is not an autonomous entity disconnected from society." The idea from this is that Japanese people's self-actualization is focused on groups, and the group plays a huge important role in students' willingness to communicate. The other quote is from MacIntyre, Dornyei, Clement and Noels as they're describing their heuristic model of willingness to communicate, and it says, "At the center of our model is an individual who has some control over his or her actions." So what we can see from this is that in the original heuristic model from 1998, we were considering students who are self-actualizing individual personal goals, not considering group needs and group goals, which is the opposite from what I've just explained with Japanese students. So just to conclude, I'm going to take another look at the heuristic model. So to wrap things up, I think it's necessary to look again at the heuristic model. And I'm not arguing that it's wrong, I'm just arguing that there are some places where factors may have a more important influence in Japanese society than they do have in other cultures. So we can see that I've talked about good behaviors in the classroom. I've talked about students' attention to hierarchy and power distance, and I've talked about students' evaluation of the public and private context of a communication. Now these all refer to layer 5, box number 9, the social situation in the heuristic pyramid. But in our case, they're very, very important for Japanese students, and they seem to have a very direct influence on willingness to communicate. So maybe they should be considered the more powerful mediators of willingness to communicate. And likewise, we can see in layer 6 that students will take into account the quality of their interlocutors, whether they're a member of their in-group or whether they're a stranger, for example. And we need to think about, for example, Japanese students' group orientation. Now these things seem to fall under the intergroup climate section and intergroup attitude section of the heuristic model. And again, they have a very strong immediate influence on Japanese students' willingness to communicate. So maybe for Japanese students, these factors need to be considered as far more important than they might be for Western students. Finally, we also talked about silence, and we said that Japanese students may use silence to communicate. And so again, I think it's important for us to, when we're considering willingness to communicate, take into account silence as a form of communication. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, then please email me at ducknath@apu.ac.jp. References are on the next slide, but if you prefer more detailed explanation of these references, then please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.